Demons Rising, Living with PTSD is one of 3 books I am currently penning that documents my time in the British Army as a combat medic. Hi there, my name is Andy Brayshaw and I am an Army veteran with 43 years military service behind me. 24 of these years were spent as a combat medic in the British Army and the remainder as a medic and officer in the Australian Army. I joined the British Army straight from school as a 16-year-old schoolboy. One of the main reasons for this was to get away from an abusive stepfather who took great pleasure in beating the crap out of us kids after a drinking session at the local pub. This was almost a weekly ritual which went on for 3 days over the weekend, and there seemed to be no reprieve. During my time in the military, I have been involved in numerous armed conflicts, including the Falklands War, First Gulf War, Croatia and Bosnia, to name but a few. During this time, I have lost numerous friends and colleagues who have been either killed or wounded in action, killed or wounded as a result of terrorist attacks, or have succumbed to the demons of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Over the years, there have been many names associated with PTSD. I was first diagnosed with PTSD in 1983 after seeing action in the Falklands War. Back then, however, it was not called PTSD, but adjustment reaction disorder. PTSD is a set of reactions that can develop in people who have experienced or witnessed an event which threatened their life or safety or that of others around them. It leads to the feelings of intense fear, helplessness or horror. Anyone can develop PTSD following a traumatic event, but people are at greater risk if the event involved physical or sexual assault, they have had repeated traumatic experiences as a sexual abuse survivor, or living in a war zone, or have suffered from PTSD in the past. The Falklands War was not my first exposure to trauma. As a young boy, I had been exposed to various forms of trauma, from my parents splitting up when I was 3, being physically and mentally abused by my stepfather over many years, along with my brothers and sisters, and witnessing my best friend at the age of 6 being killed by a coal truck on our way home from school. The truck was delivering the monthly coal supply to the local housing estate when the truck's brakes failed going down a hill, causing the driver to lose control. There was a group of us kids on our way home from school, and we had just finished crossing the road when we heard the sound of screeching brakes. The truck driver was frantically banging on the horn trying to warn us. We all turned to see the truck heading straight towards us, and we all scrambled out of the way, falling into a small stream. As I climbed out of the stream, all I could hear was my friend's sister screaming hysterically. My friend never stood a chance, as he received a direct hit from the truck, causing him to be dragged underneath the wheels. The only godsend was that he was killed instantly and would never have felt a thing. Half of his body was lying out from under the front wheels, surrounded by an ever-increasing pool of blood. I will never forget the sound of his sister's screaming as she saw his motionless body under the front wheels of the truck. This image would come back to haunt me many times during my military career, along with others that had accumulated over the years. These images are what I refer to as the demons rising. There have been episodes of PTSD in one form or another documented as far back as the early Greeks. However, it became more prominent around the time of the First and Second World Wars, although back then it was known as shell shock. The effects of combat on soldiers back then was still very much a taboo that was not talked about. In the First World War, many soldiers who were suffering from the effects of shell shock were categorised as cowards who had run away from the battle. The punishment for which usually ended up with them facing the firing squad. Even though there has been much progress in how the military diagnose and treat soldiers suffering from PTSD, the stigma associated with it remains. It is easy to understand why the soldiers of today are reluctant to seek help or admit they are suffering from the effects of PTSD, when the legacy of the past still lingers. For soldiers, there has always been a stigma associated with PTSD, which had resulted in them not coming forward for help. They are reluctant to seek help through official channels, for the fear of being seen as weak and not fit to be a soldier, or the knowledge that if the soldier has a problem, let's get rid of him. I personally have felt this attitude from senior commanders during my military career. As a result of this stigma, soldiers will try to hide the torment that their minds are in, or worse still, turn to alcohol, drugs, or promiscuous activities to try and blot out their demons. These avenues, however, never work, and almost always end up with the sufferer either having a run-in with the authorities, ending up in prison, living rough on the streets, or the ultimate escape from the torment, taking their own lives. This is abundantly clear from the statistics that have been gathered in the UK from veterans who have seen active service in Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Bosnia, the Gulf, and more recently in Iraq and Afghanistan. During the Falklands War, 255 service personnel lost their lives as a result of combat or enemy action. Since the end of the conflict, more than 350 veterans have taken their own lives, including a number of my close friends. Although the Ministry of Defence dispute the figures or even deny that these deaths are attributed to the Falklands War, the bottom line is that these veterans could no longer live with the horrors and the memories of what had taken place on those barren islands in the South Atlantic. They had been tormented by the demons that they all had lived with for so many years, and the only avenue they had open to them to ease the burden that they felt they were putting on their families was to take their own lives. The means that these final acts of redemption took ranged far and wide, from hanging, shooting, carbon monoxide poisoning, jumping from bridges, walking in front of trains, or driving the car head-on into an oncoming truck. The stigma with PTSD that soldiers experience is not only found in the British Armed Forces, but also in many nations around the world. Having served 18 years in the Australian Army, I have experienced the stigma personally, and have known those who suffer and have lost the battle. The public face is that the military, no matter which country, cares for its soldiers and veterans' mental health. But the reality is much different. It wasn't until the time of the latter part of the Vietnam War that the term post-traumatic stress disorder came into use. Although when I was first experienced PTSD in the British Army after the Falklands War, the term used was adjustment reaction disorder. In the 90s, while serving with 22 Field Hospital Group during the First Gulf War, and later in 92-93 as part of the United Nations Protection Force in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, it was commonly known as battle shock. The term battle shock was first used by the Israelis after the Lebanon War in 1982. Battle shock continued to appear in British Army medical doctrine and training until the early 2000s. PTSD had also been linked to combat stress reaction, or CSR, also known as combat fatigue. Combat stress reaction, however, is an acute behavioural disorganisation normally seen by medical staff in military personnel as a direct result of the trauma of war, which decreases the combatant's fighting efficiency. The main symptoms of combat stress reaction are fatigue, slower reaction times, indecisiveness, disconnection from one's surroundings, and the inability to prioritise. However, combat stress reaction is generally of short-term duration and should not be confused with PTSD, although it can sometimes be a precursor to PTSD. The first time that exposure to trauma had an effect on me was during the Falklands War, although at the time I did not realise it. The day was Tuesday the 8th of June 1982 at a place called Bluff Cove, not far from Fitzroy Settlement, East Falkland. It would be a day that would become infamous in the history of the Welsh Guards and 16 Field Ambulance. It was a day the British Task Force would suffer its biggest losses of the war and became known as the Bluff Cove disaster. But that's a story for another day. Thank you.